questions. Firstly, I applaud the conviction of Charles Taylor, former president of Liberia, for crimes against humanity and war crimes committed in Sierra Leone during its 11-year civil war. This conviction is one more victory in the very important fight against impunity. Today is for the people of Sierra Leone, who suffered horribly at the hands of Charles Taylor and his proxy forces. This judgment brings some measure of justice to the many thousands of victims who paid a terrible price for Mr. Taylor's crimes. Charles Taylor, who was indicted while he was still president of Liberia, is the first former head of state to be convicted by an international criminal tribunal since the Nuremberg trials in 1946. He is the first head of state at the time he was indicted to be convicted by an international criminal tribunal. And as you know from today, Mr. Taylor was convicted on all 11 counts of the indictment. Today's historic judgment reinforces the new reality that heads of state cannot hide behind their positions, that they will be held to account for war crimes and other international crimes. The judgment affirms that with leadership comes not just power and authority, but responsibility and accountability. No person, no matter how highly placed he or she is above the law. The judges found that Mr. Taylor aided and abetted the crimes charged in counts 1 through 11, and that he planned with Sam Bakary the attacks on Kono, McKinney, and Freetown in late 1998 and January 1999, during which the charged crimes were committed. The trial chamber's findings make clear the central role Charles Taylor played in the horrific crimes against the people of Sierra Leone. The court convicted Mr. Taylor of the war crime of acts of terrorism against civilians, making it clear that he deliberately targeted men, women, and children. These acts of terror victimized and traumatized the people of Sierra Leone and spared no one, regardless of their gender or age. Mr. Taylor's convictions for murder acknowledges the thousands who were brutally killed. These men, women, and children were violently taken from their family and friends, and many were killed in remote locations that even today are known only to their killers. Victims' families were left destitute with emotional wounds that will never heal. The judges also convicted Mr. Taylor on all 3 counts of sexual violence, including rape and sexual slavery. Sexual violence against women and girls was a key part of Mr. Taylor's operations in Sierra Leone. Victims were savagely and repeatedly raped and were then used as sex slaves, handed from owner to owner. The emotional and physical trauma suffered by these victims will continue for a lifetime. Mr. Taylor's conviction for physical violence acknowledges the suffering of those victims who were mutilated and maimed by Mr. Taylor and his rebels. Victims lost not only their limbs, but also the means to support themselves and their families. Others carry RUF and AFRC carved on their bodies, marking them forever as victims of Mr. Taylor's crimes. The court also convicted Mr. Taylor of conscripting, enlisting, or using children under the age of 15 in hostilities. Mr. Taylor's proxy forces took children from their families and not only used them to fight, but used them to commit crimes against their fellow Sierra Leoneans. He robbed children of their childhood, and the judges have sent a clear message that this will never be tolerated. The judges convicted Mr. Taylor of enslavement. He used enslavement to exploit Sierra Leone's people and wealth. He took men, women, and children from their homes and held them captive, often for years, at the mercy and whim of their captors. I appreciate the work of the judges who presided over the conduct of this trial. The trial chamber, quite rightly, held the prosecution to very high standards of law and procedure. I also appreciate the courage and commitment of the witnesses who came forward to testify, both for the prosecution and the defense in this case. Cases and these criminal courts cannot function unless these people have the courage to come forward. As I said, today is for the people of Sierra Leone. This trial would not have taken place, indeed this court would not exist, but for the resilience and commitment of the people of Sierra Leone, who demanded the creation of this court so that they could receive some measure of justice for the crimes committed against them during the terrible civil war in their country. Following today's judgment, both parties will make submissions on sentencing, which the date for has been given today, so we have very short time limits to provide submissions to the judges to assist them to determine what would be an appropriate sentence in this case. The final stage of the case will be the appeals phase. The prosecution will closely review today's judgment to identify any potential prosecution appellate issues. I would now like to invite questions from the journalists who are here in The Hague and also from those in Freetown.
We have microphones going around. If you raise your hand,
I have already got a
microphone.
Thomas Fairfuss, ANP, Dutch National News Agency. Madam Prosecutor, as you just mentioned, the parties will make sentencing submissions shortly. I wonder if you could elaborate on the kind of sentence you are going to propose to the judges. As we all know, a life sentence is not an option at this court because you have to, the judgment will indicate a specific number of years. What number of years do you have in mind?
Well, of course, we will have to assess the reasons the trial chamber believed that Mr. Taylor was guilty of these crimes, aiding and abetting, planning the operations that resulted in the Freetown attack and those crimes. We will very carefully assess that, looking at the seriousness of the crimes and the degree of his participation. And I think it was very clear today that his support for these rebels, his planning, was central to their ability to commit these crimes over such a long period of time. We will certainly be looking at that. And we will also look at the sentences that were given to members of the AFRC and RUF, who it was that Mr. Taylor enabled to commit these crimes. So we will look at all of that, and then we will come up with a submission we believe will be appropriate for these crimes.
Yes, yes, over there. We'll be taking questions from
Prosecutor,
Freetown.
my name is Frank Simwola. I work for West Africa Democracy Radio based in Dakar. I have one question. I followed the trial keenly, and one of the major issues or points being championed by your predecessor was that Taylor bore the greatest responsibility and that he commanded and controlled the RUF. What do you make of the judge's own position on that particular issue today? That they don't think he bore the greatest responsibility as command and control of the RUF?
Well, they didn't find it wasn't one of those who bore the greatest responsibility. But certainly they disagreed with us in terms of Mr. Taylor being the superior and giving orders. We will very carefully analyze the reasons why they believe that we did not prove that. And based on that analysis, we will determine if that will become an appellate issue for us.
As a follow-up, do you think this will mitigate the kind of sentencing that will come from the court?
Please talk through the microphone.
Yeah. A follow-up, do you think this will mitigate the kind of sentencing that will come from the court?
Well, a person is sentenced for what they're convicted of, not for what they were not convicted of. So, again, we will very carefully assess the degree of his involvement in these crimes, and I believe there were several strong statements by the court today about the critical role he played, and based on that, we will make an argument as to what would be an appropriate sentence.
So we would now take a question from Freetown.
My name is Kevin Lamdo. I work for Cotton Tree News, Freetown. My question here is, we are talking about transitional justice, and it is not just to try and convict people. We are talking about reparations too. What is the special court going to do in order to address the issue of reparation for those victims, while Mr. Taylor, even though he has been convicted, he is still a rich man and those victims are still poor and nobody is looking out to help them? Thank you.
Of course, the statute and rules of the court do not speak of reparations. They do speak of forfeitures, and there are very specific findings that have to be made if you have a hearing on forfeitures. However, the rules also allow the registrar to transmit to the government of Sierra Leone the findings in this case. And of particular importance today would be the findings relating to Mr. Taylor receiving diamonds from the rebels in Sierra Leone. And then it is for individuals, should they wish to bring a claim against Mr. Taylor's assets, to go forward to make such a claim. However, those assets would have to be identified as proceeds of his criminal activity, and that is not always so easy. But that would be the procedure that would be followed.
Yes.
The alternate judge appeared to be attempting to make some kind of a dissenting statement at the end of the hearing, and I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Well, he did make a dissenting statement, a very short one. Of course, he is entitled to his own view of things. I have no knowledge of the dynamic in the trial chamber. I can't comment on any of that. I can simply say that even though he would not vote on the judgment, he did wish to express his contrary views, and he did that.
I am a journalist working for Radio Democracy 98.1 FM, and Reverend Matthew Corti. When will Charles Taylor spend his imprisonment? Where will Charles Taylor spend his imprisonment when he will be sentenced by the judges on the 30th of May this year?
He will spend his imprisonment in the United Kingdom pursuant to an agreement that was reached at the time it was thought he would be brought forward to the court.
Okay, we'll take a question from the lady in red over there. We can't. What exactly was the dissenting? Sorry, we can't get you. Can you?
Hello, this is Rochelle Paley. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Okay, Rochelle Paley representing Music International as well as Congress News. I think inquiring minds want to know what was.
Inquiring mind want to know why that microphone's not working.
Rob Tell Paley, once again representing Pambazuka News and Newsweek International. I have two quick questions. One is, inquiring minds want to know what was that dissenting opinion by one of the judges who raised alarm after the hearing was dismissed? And then, in terms of crimes committed in Liberia, obviously we're not here to discuss crimes potentially or allegedly committed in Liberia, but can Taylor be tried for crimes committed in Liberia if a case is brought forth in an international court or a domestic court while he's simultaneously serving time for crimes committed in Sierra Leone? Is that legally possible?
Okay. Your first question, let's be clear on terminology. There was no dissenting opinion. 3 judges had the power to vote, and it was a unanimous opinion. There was a dissenting view from the alternate judge who did not vote on the findings under the rules. He's there in case one of the 3 is unavailable. And so he voiced his views in the courtroom and had divergent views from the unanimous decision of the trial chamber. As to the second question, there is nothing in law that would automatically preclude another prosecution while a person is serving time in jail for a prior conviction.
Can we hear from Freetown?
Raouf Jacob, Worldwide Cinema Frames, Freetown. Many Sierra Leoneans, including myself, would thank the court for such a verdict, but there are still other dictators throughout the continent of Africa, including that of Sudan, who are committing humanitarian atrocities and have still not been held accountable. What's the court's take on that?
Well, I don't know about the court's take, but my take is that people who commit these atrocities should have their accountability determined in a court of law, and that they will get a fair hearing. That doesn't mean they'll be acquitted. That means they'll get a fair hearing, they'll get a fair trial. And so I would urge states out there who are helping fugitives from justice remain fugitives from justice to turn them over to international courts so they can be tried. The answer is not to stop trying those we are trying. The answer is to broaden the scope so that impunity is no longer a viable concept throughout the world.
Another Freetown? Anyone from Freetown? Okay, Thomas.
A follow-up question of victims and reparations. Your predecessor, who is with us today, told us years ago that the court was looking for assets of Charles Taylor, maybe hidden somewhere in bank accounts all over the world, that might be used in the future in compensation procedures. Have you been continuing that search for hidden assets of the accused? And have those efforts led to the result, some kind of result, like you're having identified, for example, bank accounts that might be used in reparation procedures?
Well, we're certainly not the primary actor in that. And when we think today about what it takes to actually trace assets in the international community, the primary actors and the ones we should be looking to with those questions is the United Nations panel of experts on the assets freeze. And they continue to very actively attempt to find Mr. Taylor's assets. And of course, if those assets are identified, then hopefully those assets will be frozen, they will be secured so that Mr. Taylor's victims will have the ability to try to gain forfeitures compensation for the crimes committed against them.
I think we'll take two more questions.